This is a great new day, the first chapter. We will alternate between 15-minute and 10-minute, I'm thinking. But let's begin with 15 minutes. And let's commence game 1. Here we go. Okay, we got a game. Marcy P. Okay, definitely we play e4, that's for sure. Yeah, so let's begin by playing the 4-knight Scotch. I propose this opening as an initial opening because essentially, well, first of all, in many of these games, we're not even going to get knight c6, and that problem is going to be solved for us. This is one of those games. Queen f6, pretty common move at this level. Obviously, it's bad for many reasons. But the main one is that black not only doesn't develop a minor piece, but deprives the square of the g8 knight. And reacting to such openings is a lot easier than it seems, right? And the first step in reacting to them is generally to actually get the advantage in development. And then you're going to think about opening up the center. So you don't need to play d4 here, right? Let's just go knight c3. Another approach would have been pawn c3 and d4, but I like to play with the pieces at this basic level. Okay, c6. Already here, I would think about going d4 and opening up the center because there's already an imbalance of 2 developed pieces to 0. And obviously the queen gets vulnerable in these types of situations. So, oh yeah, the timer is off. Let me just adjust the timer. So this would be a great time. This would be a great time to play d4, and I think that's what we're going to do. Once I adjust the timer. Okay. Sorry about this. All right. So let's go d4. And let's open up the center. All right, he takes d4. We take with the knight. We could have also played bishop g5 here, but I'm avoiding any complicated intermediate moves. Bishop c5. What to do now? How should we proceed in this position? And yeah, knight b3 would be an excellent move. Yeah, of course, bishop b3. This is kind of an easy developing move that also protects the knight. I think a lot of beginners here would be tempted to go knight f3. But don't hesitate to defend a piece with another piece. This is one of the safest ways of defending it, to have a bishop on the neighboring diagonal square. All right. So far, we are simply developing. He goes d6. Okay, so let's take stock of what we still need to develop. We need to castle one way or the other, and we need to develop our bishop from f1. In what order do we do things? Well, generally, I like to develop the bishop first because we could actually potentially castle a queenside. And I don't know which way we want to castle. I want to wait and see what black does. And that's one of the techniques for solving the problem of where to castle. So let's start by developing the bishop. Well, where do we go? This square's out of the question. It blunders the knight. Bishop e2 is always possible. But to me, bishop c4 is going to be the most active move in these cases. Some of you might notice the move b5, but then we'll just drop the bishop back to b3. Knight h6, actually not a bad move. And already at this level, you have to be asking yourself what your opponent wants. And one of the triggers for that is when your opponent makes an unusual developing move, whether they develop the knight to the side of the board or some weird move to the side of the board, something like that. You have to smell a rat, because oftentimes there's going to be some hidden intention. And if you look carefully, it's not that black wants to play bishop g4. That's not dangerous, because then we just move our queen. I think that black wants to go knight g4, and that actually is dangerous, because then black threatens to ruin our pawn structure, and we can't move our bishop because the knight is defended. Now we have f3 and h3, and in 90% of cases when you choose between these two moves, you generally want to choose h3. And since we already pushed a pawn on the king side, it does make a lot of sense here to play queen d2 and castle queenside. Because not that castling kingside would be unsafe for our king. More so that this pawn on h3 can serve as an anchor for a further pawn that reaches g4. That's the logic. All right, so we have a tactic here. We have a tactic, but it's very messy, and I don't want to rely on these things while we're still in the beginner stage. So we're just going to drop the bishop back, but I'll talk about this afterward. Knight a6. Okay, so this guy likes to develop pieces to the side of the board. That doesn't affect us. We castle. And now we are ready, at last, to start attacking on the king side. You have opposite side castling. Oh, we could have also taken this pawn. I didn't even see. Yeah, we can take it now. We can take this pawn on c6. I didn't even notice it. The idea of bishop b6 is probably to go c5, which itself is not very dangerous. Remember that when pawns are pushed, there very often will be other pawns that are left undefended. So just always ask yourself that, as well as squares. But I don't see any reason for us not to take this pawn. That's a free pawn. It chops the legs completely off of black's sort of pawn phalanx. Now this hangs, that hangs, and we can start taking stuff. Many good moves in this position. But there's one move that immediately appeals to me because it attempts to squeeze the most out of the position. A good move here would be to take the pawn on d6. A bad move would be to play knight takes b5, because that diverts the knights away from the center and it gives away the e4 pawn. But a really good move would be knight d5, simply centralizing the knight, attacking the queen. And if you look more carefully, you'll notice that the queen simply doesn't have that many good squares. If he goes queen g6, there's a fork. Queen e6, there's a discovery. But what black has to do is take the bishop first and then go queen e6. These are only moves. But even there, we've clearly achieved a lot by getting this knight onto such a nice square. Okay, queen g6 is a pretty common blunder at this level. Does it matter which knight you put on e7? No. If you're already winning the queen, and I see players doing this a lot, don't overthink winning moves. If you have two ways to deliver a fork and you're winning a full queen, it's probably not going to matter. You want to compare the two moves quickly, but you don't want to sit there and obsess over, minuscule differences in two ways of winning a queen. They both win a queen. Okay, what to do now? We've talked many times on the speedrun about techniques of converting an advantage. When you are up a queen, the best approach is oftentimes just brute force. Destroy your opponent's pawn structure, end the game. I would not take b6, actually. I would start by looking at black's king to see if we can't just finish the game immediately. And, if you look at that side of the board, you should see bishop takes h6. Now, don't think of this move as g takes h6, queen takes h6. Don't tie yourself to that move. Always reassess the situation every time your opponent's king side has been weakened, right? He's taken on h6 with a pawn, which means that pawn used to be on g7, and immediately I see that this opened up a diagonal. We have checkmate, queen c3 or queen d4 check. Doesn't matter. I just played queen c3 to make sure that it wasn't on, on the path of the bishop. Now the king walks right into a secondary x-ray. Now, knight f6 is not checkmate. Common blunder, making a double check or a discover check, forgetting that the piece that's delivering the check is blocking a formerly controlled diagonal. Okay, that's a twisted way of saying that the queen controls g7, and after knight f6, you relinquish that control. But the mate here is knight e7. This is a double check, and it's a mate because the queen controls all of the king's possible escape squares. This is very winnish. Okay. Simple game, but I think a good start to the speedrun. Let's have a quick look. Yeah, my opponent played fast, which is going to be pretty common at this level. I faced this move once in my career when I was 1600. That game ended in the only smothered mate I've ever delivered in my chess career. Okay, 1 second. Yeah, I delivered smothered mate for the first time in my chess career, and the only time. Thank you, Tom Hawker. So knight c3, we develop our piece. c6 is probably not such a bad move because it controls the d5 square. Just a little note that after knight c6, I think a lot of people here would instantly go knight d5, centralizing the knight, attacking the queen and the pawn. One little thing I'm going to say as we just get started is that, one move-itis is I think plays a much bigger role in the beginner's thinking patterns than I previously thought. Because even up until 1600, I find that people, they see a move that creates a threat, and sometimes two threats, and their thinking stops there. Because you feel like just by doing that, you're making improvements. That's very often not the case. Now here, knight d5 is actually not as impressive as it may appear. It's not a bad move. It's not a bad move by any means, but it's maybe not the best move. The reason why is that now black is going to get the knight out to f6. And then black is going to offer a knight trade, and you've just moved your knight twice. And you might very well have to either acquiesce to a trade or retreat it back to c3. So in this position, I would play the much simpler bishop c4, just continuing my development and potentially even d3. Okay, so c6, now we open up the center. Now is a great time because black has nothing developed. Yeah, bishop g5, by the way, was also a possible move, just developing the bishop and hitting the queen. But no reason to be fancy. Bishop e3, bishop c4. Knight h6, aiming for g4, so we prevent that. Now, I just want to briefly explain why the move f3. Where does Ben Feingold's statement actually come from? What is the science behind f3 often being bad? Because we all know that he's right. We joke about it, but f3 often is a very big weakening move, whereas something like g3, which intuitively would seem to weaken more squares, isn't talked about in the same way. Well, there's two reasons. First is that f3, unlike g3, is oftentimes a tempting move for beginners because it does a couple of different things. It gives a sense of comfort, I think. It builds up a pawn chain. It defends g4. It does accomplish a lot. The problem is that this diagonal that I indicated with one arrow, and this with the other arrow, are two of the most high-trafficked diagonals on the board. That means a lot is going on there. Think about how often you develop your bishop to c4, bishop to c5, how often a queen goes to b3 or a queen to b6. Pretty darn often. And in my opinion, one of the biggest reasons f3 is so dangerous is that it creates weaknesses along that diagonal. Your king is often on g1, so you're often going to get pinned, or there's going to be something that becomes undefended, such as the bishop. And this undefended piece on e3 is another big deal, because if your opponent has a rook on e8, anytime the e-file opens, whatever stands there is going to be weak. And presumably your d-pawn has already moved away. So even though it doesn't weaken as many squares mathematically as a move like g3, it creates long-term weaknesses that are very likely to be exploitable in the course of the game. So that's very abstract, but maybe that helps you put things into context a little bit. And that's why what you'll see me doing is often playing h3 in favor of f3 when I need to defend the g4 square. Okay, so queen d2. And last thing really to talk about, because, you know, once the c6 pawn was blundered, the game basically ended, is that there is a tactic here. You always have to watch for this tactic. When your opponent hasn't developed their queen side at all, this is a particular type of idea that needs to be looked for. Things that bring it on include a lead in development, because it's likelier to happen. Or sometimes if the queen is out early, it can trigger this type of tactic. Who sees it? Yeah, so this rook has no square. So if you put a bishop on this diagonal, it's going to trap the rook. Takes, and bishop d5. And the important thing is that black cannot even get an exchange for that rook. The bishop is going to return home scot-free. But one of the most important rules of calculation is that you never assume that a move is forced unless it actually is. You need to pause on every move and ask yourself whether your opponent might not have hidden resources. And if you look very carefully, black, I think, has two resources that complicate the game. I'm not sure that they necessarily work. The first is bishop a6. It pins the knight to the bishop, because I noticed that the bishop on c4 is unprotected. The second is the move d5, trying to plug the hole with a white pawn and then take on b5. So complexity arises out of these positions where lots of stuff is hanging. White probably should go bishop b3 here to preserve the ability to take on d5 of the bishop. But why complicate things when we can just castle, or we can just drop the bishop? So why not knight d takes b5? Yeah, similar reason. I mean, takes, and bishop a6. But maybe this was the computer recommendation. I don't really know. But all of this for a pawn is a little bit absurd. So that's a rule of thumb that I'll end with here. If you're trying to work out these long lines, you're not sure about whether to grab a pawn. When in doubt, don't grab it. Because at the level of beginners, even intermediate players, pawns are not going to determine the result of the game. It's not a common reason that somebody lost. Oh, I lost a pawn, then you traded all of the pieces, and then I lost the game. That happens, of course, but it's rare. And so don't concern yourself too much if you're unsure about whether you can get away with grabbing a pawn. It's often not worth calculating, not worth spending a lot of time on. It's the sort of thing you either do it quickly or not at all. And once knight a6 was played, see, I didn't even see that this pawn was hanging, but we saw it on the next move. We centralized the knight. This is a great example of that. Not bothering to grab the second pawn, but prioritizing piece placement instead and centralizing the knight. And that's it. Knight e7, we win the queen and we win the game. What about taking the knight with the bishop to mess up the pawn structure? Yeah, so this would be tempting for a lot of players. The problem with this move is that it leads to a queen trade. In order to ruin your opponent's pawn structure, you have to trade queens. And then you've kind of defeated the purpose of ruining the kingside pawn structure. Of course, white is much better. But I could already smell blood, and so keeping the queens on the board made more sense. Yeah, when we get to a stronger level, I'll start redefining the way that you should look at things, including pawns. But hopefully that was an adequate first game. Welcome to edition 3. And we will continue this in future streams. But I'm going to head out. I have to go. I know this was a short one, but hopefully it was sweet. Bye, everybody.